When I walked into the recovery room and saw my own son standing over my hospital bed with a clipboard instead of flowers, I knew something was wrong. My daughter-in-law stood beside him, arms crossed, not even pretending to look worried. The doctor came in a moment later, glanced at the papers in my son's hand, and froze. His face went white as a bedsheet. He looked at my son, then at me, then back at the papers like he'd seen a ghost. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "You're trying to commit Walter Briggs?" The room went dead silent. My son's hand, the one holding the pen for me to sign away my own freedom, started to shake. He had no idea who he was standing in front of. None of them did. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 68 years old, and for the better part of 4 decades, I built and sold heavy equipment out of a little lot on the edge of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Nothing fancy, just hard work, long hours, and a handshake that meant something. My wife Eleanor passed 3 years ago from a stroke that took her in her sleep, quiet and merciful, the way she'd have wanted it. Since then, it had just been me and the dog, rattling around a house that used to be full of noise. If you've ever lost the person who made a house feel like a home, you know exactly what I mean. Hit that like button for me, would you, son or daughter, wherever you're watching from tonight, and tell me down in the comments what corner of the country you're tuning in from and what time it is where you're sitting right now. I read every single one. It means more to me than you know to hear from you. This whole nightmare started about 4 months ago. On a Tuesday, I remember clear as glass, because it was Eleanor's birthday, and I'd gone out to the cemetery that morning to leave her favorite daffodils, same as I do every year. When I got back to the house, there was a letter waiting in my mailbox from the bank. Eleanor and I had set up a modest trust years back. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make sure I'd be taken care of and that something would be left for our boy, Cody, when I was gone. The letter said there'd been a withdrawal request filed against the trust for $60,000, and it needed my signature to process. Problem was, I hadn't requested any withdrawal. I hadn't signed a single thing. I called the bank first thing. The woman on the line, kind as she tried to be, told me the request had come in through my son, who held power of attorney on a portion of the account in case of emergency, something Eleanor and I had set up years back when Cody was just starting his business, and we wanted to make sure he could act fast if anything ever happened to either of us. I'd forgotten that paperwork even existed. I asked her to hold the withdrawal until I could get to the bottom of it, and she agreed. Then I called Cody. He picked up on the second ring, all smiles in his voice, the way he always sounded when he wanted something. "Hey, Pop, what's going on?" I asked him straight out about the $60,000. There was a pause, just a half second too long before he laughed it off. "Oh, that. Yeah, Pop, it's nothing. It's a business thing. I'll explain when I see you. Don't worry about it." I told him I wasn't signing anything until I understood what it was for, and he got quiet again, then said he and Bridget, his wife, would come by Saturday to talk it through. They showed up that Saturday evening in Bridget's new SUV, the kind that costs more than I made my whole first year in business. Cody walked in wearing a sport coat like he was heading to a board meeting instead of his father's kitchen. Bridget had that tight, practiced smile she always wears, the one that never quite reaches her eyes. I put the bank letter on the table between us and asked him plain, "What is this for, son?" He sighed, like I was the one being unreasonable, told me his construction supply company had hit a rough patch, some contracts had fallen through, and he needed a bridge loan to cover payroll before a big payment came in from a client. Said it was temporary, said he'd pay every dime back with interest. I told him I understood hard times. Lord knows I'd had my share running my own shop, but $60,000 wasn't something I could just hand over on a handshake anymore, not with that money meant to be Eleanor's legacy too. That's when Bridget spoke up, and her voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard before. "Walter, we wouldn't even be asking if it wasn't serious. And frankly, it's not like you're using that money for anything. You barely leave this house anymore." I felt something cold settle in my chest at that. I told her I appreciated her concern, but the money wasn't sitting idle. It was my safety net, and I'd like to think it carefully before signing anything that big away. Cody's jaw tightened. "Dad, you've been more forgetful lately." Bridget noticed it too. "Maybe it's time we started handling more of this for you." I told him I was sharp as I'd ever been, and he just looked at me with this expression, this patient, pitying expression, like he was talking to a child who didn't know any better. They left that night without the signature, but something in the air had changed. I could feel it in my bones. The hunt had begun, and I just didn't know yet that I was the one being hunted. 2 days later, Bridget showed up at my door alone, holding a small paper bag from the pharmacy. Said she'd talked to my doctor, Dr. Okafor, and that he'd recommended a new supplement for my blood pressure and memory, something gentle, over the counter, nothing to worry about. She set the little orange bottle on my counter and told me to take one each morning with breakfast. Now, I want you to understand something about me. I spent 31 years as a union safety inspector before I retired, going through machine shops and construction sites with a fine-tooth comb, looking for the one thing that didn't add up, the one bolt that was loose, the one report that didn't match the paperwork. I have a nose for when something is wrong, even when I can't put my finger on why. And something about that little bottle didn't sit right with me. But she was my son's wife. She'd brought my grandkids over for Sunday dinners for years. I told myself I was being a paranoid old fool, that grief and stress were making me suspicious of people who loved me. So I took the pill that morning with my coffee. Same as she said. Within 10 days, I didn't recognize my own body. I'd wake up and feel like I was wading through wet cement just getting to the bathroom. My hands that had assembled engines and signed off on safety reports my whole working life, started trembling so bad I dropped my coffee mug twice in 1 week, shattered it right there on the kitchen tile. The fog in my head got so thick some afternoons I'd stand in the garage and forget what I'd walked out there for. I'd sit in Eleanor's old reading chair and stare at the wall for an hour without realizing time had passed at all. Cody and Bridget started stopping by more often during this stretch, and every visit, they'd comment on it. "Dad, you seem really out of it today." "Pop, did you forget we talked about this yesterday?" Each time, that old prosecutor's instinct in me, except I wasn't a prosecutor, I was an inspector, but the instinct is the same. That instinct screamed that something was deliberately being done to me. But the fog made it so hard to hold on to that thought for more than a few minutes before it slipped away again. It was my granddaughter, Lily, who saved me, though she didn't know it at the time. She's 12, sharp as a tack, takes after her grandmother. She came to stay with me for a weekend while Cody and Bridget went to some business conference, and on the second morning, she watched me take my pill with breakfast and asked, real casual, "Grandpa, why do you take vitamins that make you so sleepy?" Mom takes the same kind sometimes when she wants to sleep on long car rides. I asked her what she meant, and she said Bridget kept a bottle of similar-looking pills in her purse, the white ones, that she called her travel pills. Something about that stuck in my craw, something fierce. The next morning, instead of swallowing the pill, I tucked it into a napkin when Bridget wasn't looking. I had an old friend from my inspector days, Hank Doyle, whose daughter worked as a pharmacist over in Broken Arrow. I drove out there myself, the first time I'd driven anywhere alone in almost 3 weeks, and asked her to look at it. She called me 2 days later, and her voice was tight and careful in a way that told me everything before she even said the words. It wasn't a vitamin at all. It was a strong sedative, the kind used to manage severe anxiety in hospital settings. Definitely not something prescribed for a 68-year-old man with no history of anxiety whatsoever, and absolutely not something Dr. Okafor would have recommended, which I confirmed myself 2 days after that when I called his office directly and learned he'd never spoken to Bridget at all. There was no recommendation. There never had been. I sat in my truck in that pharmacy parking lot for a long while after that call, just gripping the steering wheel, feeling something shift inside me, the grief and the fear burning away and leaving something harder and more clear-eyed behind it. They wanted me declared incompetent. That's what this was. Drug the old man until his hands shake and his mind fogs, get a doctor or a judge to see exactly what they wanted them to see, and then they'd have control of everything, the trust, the house, all of it. And that $60,000 would just be the first withdrawal of many. My own son, my own granddaughter's father. I want to tell you, I did not confront them. Every instinct in me wanted to drive straight to Cody's office and put that pharmacist's report on his desk and demand to know how he could do this to his own father. But 31 years of inspecting sites taught me something Eleanor used to tease me about constantly. You don't accuse a man of cutting corners until you've documented every single corner he cut. So I went quiet. I started forgetting things on purpose when they visited, played the role they wanted to see, let them think their plan was working beautifully. Meanwhile, I stopped taking the pills entirely, flushed every single one, and started keeping a private log of dates, conversations, every visit, every comment about my memory, Every time Bridget conveniently reminded me of something that had never happened. I drove back out to Hank's daughter and had her test 2 more pills from later bottles, just to be sure this wasn't some one-time mistake. It wasn't. Same sedative, every time. I also did something they never saw coming, something that took every ounce of nerve I had left. I called an old friend, Margaret Yoon, who I'd known since back in my inspection days when she was a young attorney handling workplace negligence cases, and I was the guy testifying about exactly what had gone wrong on a job site. She'd built a career since then, specializing in something most folks don't even know is a real specialty: elder financial exploitation and guardianship fraud. I told her everything. She didn't blink. She'd seen this exact playbook more times than she could count: family members manufacturing incompetency to seize control of assets before the parent ever had a chance to update their will or fight back. She told me something that stuck with me through everything that came after. Walter, the families that do this always make one mistake. They get so confident in the performance that they forget the man underneath it is still paying attention. 3 weeks into building our case, quietly photographing the pill bottles, recording dates, gathering bank statements, Bridget made her move. She filed an emergency petition in county court requesting guardianship over me on the grounds of diminished mental capacity, citing my memory lapses and physical decline as documented, she claimed, by multiple family visits. Cody signed it alongside her. My own boy, the one I taught to ride a bike on the gravel road behind our first house, signed papers asking a judge to strip away my right to make my own decisions. The hearing was scheduled fast, the way these things often are when families push for emergency standing, and Margaret told me to let them believe right up until that morning that I had no idea what was coming. No lawyer, no defense. I followed her advice to the letter. I showed up to that courtroom in my old work boots and a flannel shirt, looking every bit the confused widower they'd built their whole case around. Cody wouldn't even look me in the eye walking in. Bridget had this little satisfied smile on her face, like the whole thing was already settled. The judge was a woman named Diane Castellano, and when she opened the file and reviewed the initial petition, she looked up at me with what I can only describe as practiced sympathy, the kind a judge probably has to wear 100 times a week. She asked if I had representation. That's when Margaret rose from the back of the courtroom, where she'd been sitting quiet as church, and walked up to the table beside me. Cody's face changed the instant he saw her, recognition flickering across it, though he couldn't quite place from where. Margaret introduced herself, and then she introduced the documentation she'd be presenting. The pharmacist's lab report identifying the sedative, the timeline showing Dr. Okafor had never prescribed or recommended anything, bank records showing the original $60,000 withdrawal request filed before any memory concerns had ever been raised, and finally, a sworn statement from my own granddaughter about the pills in her mother's purse. Judge Castellano's expression shifted as Margaret laid it out piece by piece, no longer practiced sympathy but something sharper, something closer to alarm. She looked at the lab report for a long moment, then looked up, not at Cody, not at Bridget, but at me, really looked at me for the first time since I'd walked in, and I watched the recognition dawn on her face, slow and then sudden, the way a name finally surfaces after sitting on the tip of your tongue for an hour. She set down the papers. Her hand actually trembled slightly against the folder. "Mr. Briggs," she said, her voice dropping low enough that the whole courtroom leaned in to hear it. "Were you the safety inspector on the Riverside Tower collapse case?" Walter Briggs, the one whose testimony got the Callaway construction executive sent to prison for falsifying inspection reports. The room went absolutely silent. Cody turned to look at me like he'd never seen me before in his life. In a way, he hadn't. I'd never talked much about that case, never wanted the attention, never wanted my own son growing up in the shadow of his father testifying against powerful men. I just nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor, that was me." She closed the file in front of her. "Then you understand fraud and falsified records about as well as anyone who's ever stood in this courtroom." Bridget's smug little smile evaporated entirely. Cody's hand, the one resting on the table in front of him, started shaking, the same way mine had been shaking for 3 weeks straight from a drug his own wife had fed me. What followed took another hour, but it felt like it happened in 5 minutes once it started moving. Judge Castellano dismissed the guardianship petition outright, called it what it was on the record: an attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult through deliberate medical sabotage. She referred the case directly to the district attorney's office for criminal review. Bridget was charged with elder abuse and administering a controlled substance without authorization. Cody, though he claimed he hadn't known the full extent of what Bridget was doing, faced his own charges for fraud related to the original $60,000 withdrawal request and for knowingly filing a false guardianship petition. I watched my son break down in that courtroom, watched 4 decades of being his father collapse into about 90 seconds of watching him understand, fully and completely, what he'd let happen to me. I won't pretend it didn't break something in me too. There's no version of justice that doesn't hurt when it's your own blood standing on the other side of it. Bridget received 18 months in a state facility, along with a permanent restraining order, keeping her away from me and, more painfully for everyone, away from Lily for the duration of her sentence. Cody avoided prison time through a plea agreement involving probation, mandatory financial counseling, and full restitution. But the damage to what we'd had as father and son will take a long time to mend, if it ever fully does. He came to see me about a month after everything settled, sat on my porch where he used to sit as a boy, and apologized in a way that felt real, not performed. The first honest conversation we'd had in years. I told him I forgave him, because I do, but forgiveness and trust are not the same animal, and trust has to be rebuilt one true thing at a time. With Margaret's help, I restructured the trust entirely, moved it into something far more protected, with safeguards that would make what happened to me nearly impossible to replicate. And I did something else too. I started volunteering with Margaret's organization, speaking with other seniors across Tulsa County about exactly the warning signs I'd ignored in myself, the unmarked pill bottles, the seed and interest from family and power of attorney, the subtle campaign to convince you that your own mind can't be trusted. If even one family out there recognizes what's happening before it goes as far as mine did, then something good came out of all of it. It's autumn again now, almost a year to the day since that first letter showed up in my mailbox. I was out at the cemetery again this morning, same as every year, laying daffodils for Eleanor, telling her everything that's happened, the way I always do, like she can still hear me. Maybe she can. Lily comes by most Saturdays now, just the two of us, and we work in the garden Eleanor used to keep, and she asks me questions about my old inspection days, the cases I worked, and for the first time in years, I find myself willing to tell those stories instead of burying them. Trust, I've learned, isn't a soft thing you hand out because someone shares your blood. It's something that has to be earned and re-earned, watched over the way you'd watch a structure for the first crack before the whole thing comes down. Love your family. Love them with everything you have. But never, ever stop paying attention, because the people closest to you are also the only ones standing close enough to do the damage. If this story meant something to you tonight, hit that subscribe button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me down below, where are you watching from, and how is your evening treating you? I read every word, and it means the world to this old man sitting alone with his dog and his garden, grateful for every single one of you who stopped by to listen. Trust isn't something you owe someone just because they share your last name. It's something earned a little at a time, and protected the same way. Paying attention to the people you love isn't suspicion, it's care. And even after betrayal, there's still room for forgiveness, still room for a granddaughter in the garden, still room to turn pain into something that protects someone else down the road. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI for entertainment purposes, while hoping to share a positive and meaningful life lesson with you.